In January of 1842, a British army doctor named William Brydon rode alone into the gates of Jalalabad, half dead, slumped over his horse, the last visible survivor of a column that had set out from Kabul a week earlier with roughly 16,000 soldiers and camp followers. The Afghans had deliberately let him live, specifically so he could carry the story back to the rest of the British Empire. One man, out of 16,000, rode out of those mountains alive. That wasn't the last time it happened. 140 years later, the Soviet Union sent its own army into the same mountains, backed by the full weight of a nuclear superpower, and left a decade later having lost over 14,000 soldiers, defeated in every meaningful sense despite outgunning their opponents at every level. 40 years after that, the United States spent 20 years and $2.3 trillion trying to rebuild the same country from the ground up, and watched the government it had built collapse in 11 days. 3 different empires, 3 different centuries, 3 completely different reasons for invading, 3 completely different levels of military technology, from muskets and cavalry to tanks and helicopter gunships to satellite-guided precision weapons and stealth aircraft, and somehow the exact same ending over and over again. That repetition alone should tell you something important. Whatever is happening here almost certainly isn't about which specific weapons an empire brings with it. So here's the question worth actually digging into. Is Afghanistan really some kind of unbeatable fortress? A place where the laws of military power simply stop working? Or is something more specific going on? Something that has less to do with Afghan soldiers being unbeatable and more to do with what empires actually think they're trying to accomplish there in the first place. And here's a twist almost nobody talks about. Is the Graveyard of Empires story even fully true? Or is part of it a myth that's more convenient to repeat than to actually examine? There's a version of this story you've almost certainly absorbed already, somewhere, in a headline, a documentary, or just general cultural osmosis. Afghanistan is simply unconquerable, a place where empires go to die. Full stop. End of explanation. That version isn't entirely wrong. But it's also not the complete picture, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand something more precise and, frankly, more useful than a catchy nickname, because the actual mechanism behind Afghanistan's track record turns out to matter for understanding a lot more than just this one country's history. This is Endgame analysis, and if questions like that are exactly what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe right now, because we're about to walk through 3 empires, 3 catastrophic campaigns, and the real mechanics behind why this keeps happening. The story most people already half know starts with the British Empire, which fought 3 separate wars in Afghanistan between 1839 and 1919, and lost, in one way or another, most of the fights that mattered. Understanding exactly how and why matters here, because the specific pattern that emerges from Britain's experience is the same one you'll see the Soviet Union and the United States walk into, almost step for step, more than a century apart from each other. The First War is the one everyone eventually hears about, because it produced one of the most catastrophic military disasters in the entire history of the British Empire. In 1839, Britain occupied Kabul, worried that Russian influence was creeping toward British India, and determined to install a friendlier ruler on the Afghan throne. For a couple of years, the occupation held. Then, in the winter of 1842, Afghan tribesmen rose up, and the British negotiated what they believed was a safe passage out of the country, roughly 16,000 troops and civilian camp followers marching toward Jalalabad, 90 miles away, through the brutal winter passes of the Hindu Kush. They never made it. Afghan fighters harried the retreating column constantly, picking off stragglers in the freezing cold, ambushing the column again and again through the mountain passes. By the time it was over, somewhere around 4,500 troops and as many as 12,000 civilians had died. Only one European, William Brydon, the doctor from the opening of this video, survived to reach Jalalabad and tell the story. It remains, to this day, one of the single worst defeats any modern European army has ever suffered against a non-European force. You'd think that would be the end of British ambitions in Afghanistan. It wasn't. Britain went back in 1878 for the Second Anglo-Afghan War, and while that campaign went considerably better for London overall, it still produced its own humiliation at the Battle of Maiwand, where a British force of roughly 2,500 soldiers suffered close to 1,000 casualties in a single engagement against Afghan fighters. And in 1919, Afghanistan launched the Third Anglo-Afghan War specifically to reclaim full control over its own foreign policy from British influence, and succeeded, in large part because a war exhausted Britain, freshly out of the First World War, simply didn't have the appetite left to fight and win a fourth Afghan conflict. It's worth pausing on that sequence because it establishes a pattern that's going to repeat, almost beat for beat, across the next 2 empires covered in this video. Notice that Britain's actual military performance across these three wars was genuinely mixed. A catastrophic loss in the First War, a more successful but still costly campaign in the Second, and an outright political defeat in the Third. And what stayed constant wasn't battlefield humiliation every single time. What stayed constant was Britain's repeated inability to convert any of its military campaigns into the kind of permanent, direct control it originally set out to establish. Even after the relatively successful Second Anglo-Afghan War, Britain didn't end up ruling Afghanistan directly. It ended up funding and influencing a nominally independent government instead, a distinction that's going to matter enormously later in this video. Subscribe to EndGame Analysis now if you want the rest of this breakdown, because two more empires are about to walk into exactly the same trap, a full century and a half apart from each other. Fast forward roughly 60 years, past the collapse of British colonial power entirely, and you land on the Cold War and on a different empire making a strikingly similar mistake for strikingly similar reasons, despite having read, or at least having access to, the full historical record of exactly what had gone wrong for Britain twice before. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a struggling communist government and prevent the country from sliding out of the Soviet sphere of influence. On paper, this should have been a mismatch that barely qualified as a contest. The Soviet Union was one of two global military superpowers, equipped with helicopter gunships, tanks, and a professional standing army numbering in the millions, facing what was initially a loose, poorly equipped collection of Afghan resistance fighters, known collectively as the Mujahideen. It didn't play out that way. Over the following decade, the Soviets found themselves locked into exactly the kind of grinding, unwinnable insurgency the British had already experienced twice, fighting an enemy that melted into the mountains, struck and disappeared, refusing to offer the kind of set-piece battle a conventional military like the Red Army was actually built to win. And crucially, the Mujahideen weren't fighting alone. The United States, still deep in Cold War competition with Moscow, funneled weapons, funding and training to Afghan fighters throughout the 1980s, most famously supplying shoulder-fired Stinger missiles that dramatically reduced the Soviet military's previously dominant control of Afghan airspace. By the time the Soviet Union finally withdrew in 1989, it had lost 14,453 soldiers killed, with an additional 53,753 wounded. A staggering toll for a war that never produced anything resembling a clear military victory. The withdrawal itself and the subsequent collapse of the communist government the Soviets had spent a decade trying to prop up is widely regarded by historians as a significant contributing factor in the broader collapse of the Soviet Union just 2 years later. An empire that had survived a genuinely existential fight against Nazi Germany found one of its final major military campaigns bleeding out, slowly and expensively, in exactly the same mountains that had already broken the British Empire twice. There's an important nuance worth adding here, because it's easy to let the raw casualty numbers tell the whole story when the reality is more complicated. The Mujahideen didn't start the war anywhere close to evenly matched with the Red Army. In the early years of the conflict, Afghan resistance fighters were fighting Soviet helicopter gunships and armored columns with comparatively primitive weaponry, and Soviet forces did inflict enormous casualties on the Afghan population in return, with credible estimates, placing Afghan deaths from the war, military and civilian combined, well over 1 million people, alongside millions more forced into refugee camps in neighboring Pakistan and Iran. The Soviet Union didn't simply walk into an unwinnable fight and lose cleanly. It fought a brutal, grinding war that inflicted enormous suffering on Afghanistan itself, even as it ultimately failed to achieve its own strategic objective of securing a stable, permanently pro-Soviet government in Kabul. Both things were true simultaneously. Afghanistan absorbed a catastrophic human cost, and the Soviet Union still failed to convert that cost into a lasting political victory. Which brings us to the most recent, and in some ways the most expensive, chapter of this entire pattern, the one many people watching this video actually lived through in real time. The United States invaded Afghanistan in October 2001 in direct response to the September 11th attacks, with the specific goal of destroying al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban government that had sheltered it. That initial objective was achieved relatively quickly. What followed was something else entirely. A 2-decade nation-building project, an attempt to construct an entirely new Afghan state, military and democracy essentially from scratch, in a country whose last 3 encounters with exactly this kind of outside intervention had each ended in humiliating failure for the intervening power. It's worth being direct about how unusual that expansion of mission actually was, viewed against the specific history covered so far in this video. The United States wasn't simply unaware of Afghanistan's track record with foreign occupiers. The phrase "graveyard of empires" was already common shorthand in foreign policy circles well before 2001. American policymakers made a conscious decision to pursue full-scale nation-building anyway, calculating, at least implicitly, that modern American military and economic power represented enough of a break from British and Soviet precedent to succeed where two previous empires had failed. Defense planning that had devoted enormous attention to post-invasion strategy in the parallel war in Iraq devoted comparatively little serious long-term planning to what would actually happen in Afghanistan after the initial Taliban government fell, according to multiple post-war assessments of how the mission drifted from counterterrorism into open-ended nation-building without a clearly defined endpoint. Over 800,000 Americans deployed to Afghanistan across the full course of the war. 2004, 101 to 2,461 American service members were killed, depending on which official count you use, with more than 20,000 wounded. An additional 1,147 troops from other NATO countries lost their lives as well. Financially, the most commonly cited direct cost runs to roughly $2.3 trillion, though broader estimates that include the full range of associated war on terror expenditures push considerably higher, with some analyses, putting the total closer to $8 trillion, equivalent to roughly 40% of a single year of the entire American economy. And then, after 20 years, after that almost incomprehensible expenditure of money and lives, the Afghan government, the United States, had spent 2 decades building collapsed in 11 days. 11. Not 11 months. 11 days in August of 2021, as Taliban forces swept across the country, largely without serious resistance from the Afghan military the U.S. had spent billions of dollars training and equipping. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country as the Taliban approached the capital, reportedly departing with roughly $169 million in cash, later resurfacing in the United Arab Emirates, while the government he'd led disintegrated behind him. If you want the darkest, most fitting detail in this entire story, it's this. Throughout the American occupation, the Taliban were quietly generating an estimated $300 to $400 million a year by taxing Afghanistan's opium trade, a trade that flourished specifically during the years of U.S. presence in the country. In a very real sense, American taxpayer money and American tolerated conditions on the ground ended up helping fund the exact insurgent movement that would eventually retake the entire country the moment U.S. forces left. There's a broader irony sitting inside that detail worth drawing out because it captures something true about all three of these conflicts, not just the American one. Every single occupying power in this story ended up, in some way, strengthening the exact resistance movement it was trying to defeat simply by being present. British occupation created the conditions and the grievances that fueled the tribal uprising of 1842. Soviet occupation gave the United States a strategic incentive to arm and train the Mujahideen at scale, creating a battle-hardened insurgent network that would later evolve, in part, into the Taliban itself. And American occupation, through 2 decades of an opium trade that expanded dramatically under conditions the occupying force never fully controlled, ended, up bankrolling the very movement it had originally invaded the country to remove. In each case, the presence of the empire itself became part of what sustained the resistance against it. Subscribe to EndGame Analysis now, because the next section of this video actually challenges part of the story you've just heard, and it's the part almost nobody covering this topic bothers to mention. Here's where this story gets genuinely more interesting than the simple, unbeatable graveyard of empires version that gets repeated in headline after headline, because a serious argument exists, made by researchers at the Hoover Institution among others, that the popular narrative is, in an important sense, overblown. Their argument is this. Both the British and the Soviets, in the specific narrow sense of achieving their actual strategic objectives, largely succeeded in Afghanistan, even after their troops eventually withdrew, as long as they kept the money flowing to a friendly government in Kabul afterward. Britain's core goal after the disaster of 1842 was never really to occupy Afghanistan outright. It was to keep Russian influence out and keep control over Afghanistan's foreign policy. And by that specific measure, Britain actually got what it wanted. From 1880 all the way to 1919, nearly 40 years, Afghanistan functioned as a virtual protectorate of the British Empire, with London bankrolling a friendly ruler, first Abdur Rahman, known as the Iron Emir, and then his son, Habibullah, in exchange for exactly the foreign policy control Britain had originally invaded to secure. That reframing doesn't erase the catastrophic battlefield losses. The retreat from Kabul was still one of the worst military disasters in British history, full stop. But it does complicate the simplest version of the Afghanistan always wins narrative. What actually seems to be true across all three empires is more specific than a blanket curse on foreign armies. Afghanistan defeats, attempts at direct, permanent military occupation and top-down control almost every single time. It's been considerably more tolerant, historically, of arrangements where an outside power funds a friendly government from a distance without trying to physically rule the country itself, the exact model Britain eventually settled into, and the exact model both the Soviet Union and the United States largely failed to sustain once their own patience, money, or domestic political will finally ran out. It's worth applying that same distinction to the Soviet and American cases specifically, because it sharpens the comparison considerably. The Soviet Union actually did attempt something closer to the Britain model for a period, propping up the communist Afghan government with financial and military aid, even after officially withdrawing combat troops in 1989. That aid-only arrangement held the Kabul government in place for roughly 3 more years, longer than most people realize, before the government finally collapsed in 1992, not coincidentally around the same period the Soviet Union itself was disintegrating and could no longer sustain the funding. The pattern holds again: withdraw the troops, but keep the money flowing, and you can sustain influence for years. Cut off both simultaneously, and collapse follows quickly. The United States, when it withdrew in 2021, cut off both the troops and, within weeks, the financial and logistical support the Afghan government had depended on to function, which helps explain why the collapse there took 11 days, rather than the several years it took the Soviet-backed government to fall after 1989. So if it's not simply an unbeatable curse, what's actually driving this pattern across 3 completely different centuries, 3 completely different empires, and 3 completely different geopolitical contexts? Start with geography, because it's the most obvious factor and also the most consistently underestimated one. The Hindu Kush mountain range dominates much of Afghanistan, a brutal high-altitude terrain of narrow passes and steep valleys that has been turning straightforward military campaigns into prolonged nightmares since long before any of the 3 empires covered in this video. Even Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan, 2 of history's most successful conquerors, struggled significantly in the same region centuries earlier. Terrain like that neutralizes many of the conventional advantages a modern mechanized military typically relies on: heavy armor, air superiority, and rapid maneuver all become considerably less decisive when your enemy can simply retreat into mountains your equipment can't easily reach. Second, Afghanistan has historically functioned less like a single centralized nation-state with one capital whose fall ends the war, and more like a patchwork of tribal, regional, and ethnic power structures with their own separate loyalties and leadership. Capturing Kabul in each of these 3 conflicts never actually meant capturing the country, because political power in Afghanistan has rarely been concentrated entirely in its capital the way it typically is in more centralized states. An occupying force can win every conventional battle and still find itself controlling only the cities, while the actual country continues fighting back from the countryside. This decentralized structure also means there's rarely a single leader whose death or capture ends the resistance, unlike wars against more centralized states where removing a single ruling figure can effectively end organized opposition. Defeat one regional commander or tribal leader in Afghanistan, and the resistance in a dozen. Other valleys continues completely unaffected, operating under its own separate leadership with its own separate resources. Third, and this pattern shows up specifically in both the Soviet and American conflicts, Afghanistan's wars against outside powers have repeatedly become proxy wars for other, larger geopolitical rivalries. The US armed the Mujahideen specifically to bleed the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Various regional powers played their own complicated roles during the 2001 to 2021 conflict as well, including sanctuary and support networks operating across the border in Pakistan that gave Taliban fighters a safe haven. The United States was never able to fully close off, despite 2 decades of trying. When a resistance movement isn't just fighting with its own limited resources, but is being actively funded and armed by a rival global power, with its own separate interest in seeing the occupier fail, the fight stops being remotely fair, no matter how large or well-equipped the occupying force actually is. And finally, there's a mismatch in time horizons that may be the single most important, least discussed factor of all. Empires operate on political clocks. Elections happen. Public opinion sours. Budgets get scrutinized. War weariness sets in back home, usually well before a genuinely difficult insurgency can be fully resolved. Afghan resistance movements across all 3 of these conflicts have consistently displayed a level of patience that simply outlasts the domestic political tolerance of whichever empire happens to be occupying them at the time. A fighter defending his own valley has no election to lose, no quarterly approval rating to protect, no domestic constituency back home demanding a withdrawal timeline. That asymmetry in patience compounds every other advantage on this list. The terrain, the decentralized power structure, and the proxy funding all matter more, not less, when the occupying power is working against its own internal clock at the same time. Subscribe to EndGame analysis if this kind of comparison across centuries and empires is what keeps you coming back. Because that patience gap is exactly why 20 years and $2.3 trillion still wasn't enough time or money for the United States either. Pull all three of these stories together, and the lesson isn't really that Afghanistan is magically unconquerable. It's something more specific and arguably more useful to understand. Raw military power, even overwhelming military power, isn't the same. Thing is the ability to permanently reshape how a place governs itself from the outside. Britain eventually learned to work with that reality rather than against it, funding friendly rulers instead of trying to occupy the country directly, and got roughly 4 decades of exactly the outcome it wanted as a result. The Soviet Union and the United States, in different centuries with completely different ideologies, both tried the more ambitious version, direct nation building, direct military. Presence, an attempt to fundamentally remake Afghan society and government from the ground up, and both paid a staggering price in lives and money before ultimately failing at exactly that more ambitious goal. That distinction between influencing a country from a distance and trying to physically rule it might be the single most important thing this entire 200-year pattern actually teaches, and it's a lesson that clearly keeps needing to be relearned expensively, roughly once every few generations. There's something almost darkly comic about the repetition once you see it laid out end to end. British officials in the 1830s knew relatively little about what had happened in Afghanistan before them, because almost nothing at that scale had. Soviet planners in the 1970s had a full, well-documented account of Britain's disasters sitting in historical archives and invaded anyway. American planners in 2001 had both the British and Soviet examples, an entire library's worth of cautionary case studies, and still expanded a narrow counterterrorism mission into the exact kind of full-scale nation-building project that had already failed twice before, in the same country, against the same underlying obstacles. That's really the uncomfortable core of this entire story. It was never a mystery. Every government that invaded Afghanistan over the last 2 centuries had access to the previous empire's failure as a cautionary tale, and every single one of them concluded, in one way or another, that their own military, their own technology, or their own ideology represented enough of a break from history to succeed anyway. None of them did, not in the way they originally intended. The mountains didn't change. The tribal power structures didn't change. The fundamental mismatch between what military occupation can achieve and what political transformation actually requires didn't change either. What changed each time was simply which empire was about to find that out the hard way. If this breakdown gave you a sharper understanding of why this keeps happening in the same mountains, across 3 completely different empires, subscribe to EndGame Analysis, because we're going to keep tracking exactly which lessons the rest of the world does and doesn't take from Afghanistan's history. Tell me in the comments. Do you think there's any set of circumstances under which a foreign power could actually stabilize Afghanistan long-term, or is direct occupation of Afghanistan simply a mistake every generation has to make for itself? I read every comment, and they shape what we cover next. One last thought worth leaving you with, because it applies well beyond this one country. The next time a major power commits to a war in unfamiliar terrain, against a decentralized opponent expecting a quick and decisive outcome, this exact pattern is worth watching for. It rarely announces itself as a mistake in the opening weeks. It looks, at first, exactly like victory. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.